Hello everyone, my name is Mel Hartley and I'm one of the team members here at the Training Accreditation Council, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar on assessment. Before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we are meeting on today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. Lastly, the Training Accreditation Council continues preparations for the commencement of the Registration Standards 2025 for RTOs who are regulated by the Council. RTOs will continue to meet the 2015 standards until amendments to the WA regulations are finalised, and we will ensure RTOs are notified as soon as the date is known. Now I'd like to hand over to Russell Docking, who is our facilitator for today. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mel, and really good to be with you all today. It's great to see and to know that there are so many people who are interested in this topic of assessment. We will start off by looking first at what will be discussed. And we have 5 topics to deal with today. Maybe you could think of it as 6. The key focus of today's session are pre-validation, which it relates to standard, the outcome standard 1.3. And as a consequence of looking at pre-validation, we move on to looking at mapping, because it's a very powerful way of carrying out a pre-validation process. Then we'll look at authenticity of assessment evidence. It's a big issue at the moment across the university sector, but it's also an issue that continues to be of concern in the vet sector. Then assessment validation practices, looking particularly at the new outcome standards 1.5, which replaced the previous standards of 1.9 through to 1.11. And finally, looking at RPL, or recognition of prior learning. We'll start, though, by looking at the importance of high-quality assessment, because it's important to keep in our minds as we go through these processes that this is not a trivial issue. It's a really important issue, and it's an issue that's important on 2 counts. One is that it's fundamentally important that we do good quality assessment, and the other is that it's an area of consistent non-compliance across many applications for in renewal of or initial registration or extension to scope. And it is also the topic of number of complaints and concerns. So it is an important issue to deal with, and one which requires a little bit of introductory information. So we'll start with that soon. The session is 90 minutes. We'll be finishing at 11 o'clock, and we'll have time for questions later on. But you'll notice on this screen that there is a QR code for questions through Menti, and a Menti code as well. So if you have questions you want to ask as we go, please pop them in through Menti, and we'll deal with them at the end of the session. So let's move into our next slide, which is the importance of high-quality assessment. And it perhaps goes without saying, but it really is important to keep this in the front of our minds, that when we make decisions as vet assessors, we're not making a kind of, dare I say it, academic decision. We're making a decision that relates to our students' futures. In higher education, a qualification or an assessment is very much focused on the past. It's about what has been learned. But in the case of vet, it's about what you can do in the future. So in vet, when we certificate a person or qualify them in relation to a unit of competency, we are basically saying something that relates to the students and their future careers. It impacts on their future employers of these students. It impacts on the productivity and safety of their workplaces. It impacts on the quality of products for consumers and the community. It impacts on the reputation of you as assessors and your RTOs, and it impacts on the credibility of the whole vet sector. And you'll notice quite often that issues, when they come up in the press about schooling or about universities, it often has to do with the quality of assessment. And so we need to understand and keep in front of our minds at all times that this is a really important part of what we do. Competency-based assessment is the strategy that we've adopted for decades now in the vet sector. And that basically says that the quality of assessment comes down to being competency-based in our processes. And the core business of RTOs is the certification of industry-relevant competencies of individual candidates. And that has to be done by a qualified assessor. So unlike most other sectors, we require not just qualifications in vet training, but particularly in vet assessment. And we have both units of competency within the Certificate for and Training and Assessment, but we also have assessment skill sets for those who are not undertaking the full qualification. Assessment qualifications of assessors is critical. And the judgment that those assessors make must meet the principles of assessment of being valid, reliable, fair and flexible. We'll come back to those in a minute, but you know them well. But again, we just need to rehearse them in a way and reflect on them as we look at the assessment issues today. And the judgment must be based on evidence that's gathered through assessment tools that are themselves valid, sufficient, current and authentic. And that's a big issue when we start looking at issues such as validation. And it's important to remind ourselves that the RTO and the assessor are accountable for the accuracy of these judgments. Any of the above might be challenged in an appeal, and all of the above are subject to validation, and that is where we're going, of course, with our workshop today. So when we start thinking about quality criteria that we're going to employ right throughout today's session, the first is that assessments must be consistent with the training product. And that is, in fact, what is specified in Outcome Standard 1.3. But it's also, the consistency also needs to be with the definition, if you like, of competency. Although the definition of competency is no longer referenced in the standards themselves, it is in the Training Package Organisation Framework, which was released in July this year. And it's the familiar definition of competency, which is that competency is defined as the consistent application of knowledge and skill to the standard of performance required in the workplace. It embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. And the key words in there are things like consistent, which means that you need to assess more than once. You can't judge consistency on a single assessment. Application of knowledge and skill means that we need to be assessing within a context where they're actually performing the skill and demonstrating the knowledge. To a standard of performance required in the workplace means that we need to be conscious of what workplaces require in terms of standards. And that has a big impact on things such as our engagement with industry and our continued understanding of industry practices and processes. So consistent with the training product extends beyond just the words in the unit of competency, but also relates to the concept of competency. Secondly, it needs to be suitable and sufficient in terms of resources and time. And that basically means that what we are looking for there is enough resources and enough time for the person to be able to engage with the assessment process and to be able to go through the assessment process with enough time. And that's referred to in Outcome Standard 1.1. And when it looks at resources and facilities and equipment, it looks at that in Outcome Standard 1.8. Then it needs to be relevant to industry. And that is picked up in Standard 1.2. Responsive to individual needs is reflected in Standard 1.4. Compliant with the principles of assessment and compliance with the rules of evidence is, of course, picked up also in Standard 1.4, and then it must be administered by credentialed assessors, and that is picked up in Standard 3.2. Now, we don't really need to dwell on this when we come to the principles of assessment, but we just need to remind ourselves now what these relate to, because these will be underpinning our validation, pre-use validation, and our post-use validation. So we need to remind ourselves that the principles of assessment is, first, that it's valid, that the judgment must reflect the demonstration requirements, including practical performance. It must be fair. The judgment process must be responsive to the needs of the students within the requirements of validity. We can't be all things to all students. We may find that it's very difficult to be fair because the requirements of the unit of competency and the validity of the application of those requirements overrides anything else. Flexible, that is, we need to find ways of being responsive and flexible in our judgment process, again, within the framework of validity. And then it must be flexible, and that means that fundamentally, flexible, we need to be able to respond to individual needs, and reliable, but whatever we do needs to be in a consistent way. That has a lot to do with having marking guides to make sure that different assessors are marking consistently. And the rules of evidence, again, you know these well, but again, they're going to play an important part in validation, both pre and post-use. And now validity takes a slightly different meaning. It fundamentally is saying the evidence we gathered needs to be valid. That is, it must reflect some aspect, at least, of the unit of competency. It must be current, that is, it must be evidence about the person's performance today, not something that might have happened in the past. It must be that means we need to know that it is really that individual's work, and we'll be looking at authenticity as a specific issue today, and sufficient. And sufficiency both relates to coverage, if you like, across all of the requirements of the unit of competency, but also sufficiency in terms of depth. That is, we have enough information to be confident that there is consistent application, not just occasional application, but consistent application. And that often means that when you look at the unit of competency, it will ask you to assess on more than one occasion across maybe a number of different clients or circumstances or number of different kinds of equipment. So when we start looking at these things, we need to apply those principles and those ideas across our topics for today. So when it comes to mapping, we're looking at how mapping assists with the development or purchase of assessment tools that meet quality requirements. When we look at pre-validation, we are basically saying, how do we know that the quality requirements are being met by the assessment tools, either the ones we made or the ones we purchased or the ones we inherited from previous trainers and assessors? How do we know that they are going to meet those requirements before they're used? Authenticity is one of the quality requirements that we will need to stress today. And then post-use validation is used to verify the quality requirements are met when their tools are actually being used. So there's a difference between looking at the tools in their kind of documented form and looking at them in terms of how they actually work. So pre-validation is done really as a document analysis, and that's where mapping plays a significant role. And then post-use validation brings into play the actual practice and use of those tools with real students in real circumstances. And then we're finally going to look at recognition of prior learning, which must still meet all these quality requirements. And we need to understand that recognition of prior learning is not some sort of soft assessment option. It is a formal assessment process leading to an outcome that is indistinguishable from somebody who's done the training. That is to say that when you've got a unit of competency through recognition of prior learning, you must have achieved the same quality standards and the same outcomes as someone who achieved that same unit of competency through a training process. And that has big implications in terms of the quality requirements and how they apply to RPL. So let's start off and launch ourselves now into the topic of pre-validation. And we're going to spend probably about half an hour on this because it is really a significant area. And in pre-validation, we're going to find ourselves looking, of course, at the mapping process. So we'll be doing pre-validation and mapping as a kind of composite topic. The standards basically say that the assessment system is fit for purpose and consistent with the training product. Now, you'll note it says the assessment system is fit for purpose. And when one looks at the assessment system in terms of definitions, and I'm being a bit of a pedant here, which is what, as an auditor, I'm sort of trained to do, the assessment system talks about policies and procedures as well as the assessment tools. But then when we look at the performance indicators for this particular outcome standards, it only talks about the assessment is consistent with the requirements of the unit of competency. The assessment tools are reviewed prior to use to ensure that the assessment is consistent with the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And I've put in brackets there that the word assessment is defined as a process for collecting evidence. So although it says the assessment system is fit for purpose, it actually is saying the assessment tools are fit for purpose and are consistent with the training product. And indeed, when you look at item C, it says the outcomes of this review inform changes to the assessment tools. So the focus really of 1.3 is the assessment tools. And so I've put in parentheses there, the process for collecting evidence is consistent with the requirements of the unit of competency. The assessment tools are reviewed prior to use to ensure that the assessment process for collecting evidence is consistent with the principles of assessment, and the outcomes of the review to inform changes to the assessment tools. This applies to all units, all ways in which you acquire assessment tools, whether you make them yourselves, you purchase them, or you are designing them for recognition of prior learning. So how do you do this? How do you do this pre-validation? What you simply could do is do a mapping, which is basically a mapping of the requirements of the unit of competency against the assessment tools. And this is often done by RTOs by simply taking a printout of the unit of competency and writing beside each aspect of the unit of competency, each element, each performance criterion, each foundation skill, each item of required of knowledge evidence, each item of performance evidence, writing beside it where it's assessed. And that does demonstrate that everything in the unit of competency is assessed. And that to a large extent would achieve much of what was provided. Of course, you would then have to look at the assessment tools to see that the mapping was in fact an accurate mapping. If this particular question and this particular test related to this particular knowledge evidence, does it actually reflect that knowledge evidence? So it's not enough just to do the mapping, but it provides a framework. But a more useful strategy is to create a matrix table. And I'll illustrate that with this one here. And the matrix table basically lists the element requirements down the left-hand side. So you see element 1, PC 1.1, 1.2, 1.4. Obviously, you would list all the elements down that side. The foundation skills, and you could call them FS1, FS2, FS3, whatever. Performance evidence, you'd list them as PE1, PE2, or whatever. And knowledge evidence, the knowledge items 1 and 2 and so on, as many knowledge items as there might be. And in doing so, what you are doing is providing a description of all the bits that need to be assessed. And then across the top of the chart, you put in the kind of assessments that you're using. So there could be a knowledge test, observations, maybe 1 or 2 observations, depending on what the unit requires. There's a validation column there. We'll come to that a bit later on. But for the purposes of this exercise, we've just populated some of the cells in this sample of what a matrix table might look like. As you can imagine, putting a whole matrix table in on one screen would be far too much text. I do need to stress here that what we're demonstrating here is that the requirements of a unit of competency are being assessed in some way or another. If you're using a clustered assessment where one assessment tool is measuring more than one unit, you'd have to do a mapping matrix table for each unit separately, because you need to be able to demonstrate that all the requirements of each unit are actually addressed somewhere. We'll come back to that a bit later on, because it also has implications for making judgments, because it really is important, even if we gather evidence on a clustered basis, that we end up making judgments on a unit-by-unit basis. It's quite possible that in a cluster of, say, 2 units, that the individual has demonstrated the qualities of one, but not the other. And it's really important that you don't decide that they've demonstrated neither units when in fact they have demonstrated one. And this mapping enables you to tease the evidence apart, where 2 units of competency are measured through one assessment process. So this provides a starting point for analysis. And it's really important that you understand that the purpose of the mapping is to both validate and check and describe how things are assessed. So it does many different functions, and as you'll see, there's a multitude of functions that this can serve. What we need to do, though, is to first of all ask some questions about this table and what the information says. So this cut-down version here does give us some things to look at. And I'm going to describe 13 questions, and indeed in the next 2 slides we're going to go through those again, just briefly, but it's because I don't expect that you'll remember them from my oral accounting of them. But keeping this table on the chart, first of all, we need to know that all requirements are listed in the left-hand column. And if we look down the left-hand column, of course, this is just a but we might notice that one performance criterion 1.3 is missing. And it's not uncommon to find that a unit requirement is missing for some reason or other. And so what you would do straight away is to say, hello, there's a problem here. There's a performance criterion missing. And if that's missing, it's not necessarily being assessed. And if it's not being assessed, then what we have is an invalid assessment process. Secondly, we need to be confident that all knowledge requirements are assessed by one or more questions. So if we look down at the knowledge evidence requirements, we can see that in the knowledge test, question 1 and 2 relate to the knowledge evidence 1. Maybe we needed 2 questions to tackle that because it was a complex or sophisticated bit of knowledge. And then we can see that question 3 is measuring knowledge evidence 2. But we can also see that knowledge evidence 2 is measured by observation 6. That may raise a question in our minds, because why are we using an observation to measure knowledge? It may be a problem. So we then need to make sure that knowledge is not being used. Our third point is the knowledge test is not being used to assess performance. Hello, we've got a problem straight away there too, because we can see that performance criterion 1.2 is measured by a question, question 6. So if performance criterion 1.2 is being measured by question 6 and not by observation, we're not seeing performance. What we're seeing is that they know about something, but we're not seeing that they can actually do something. So that raises a question. We need to then make sure that there are, as item 4, no knowledge questions that are not mapped to knowledge evidence items. Now, we can't see that on this table, but what I routinely do as an auditor is I look at the knowledge test, I write down all the numbers of the questions, so it might be a 30-question knowledge test, I write down the numbers 1 to 30. I then look to see if each of those questions is mapped to a knowledge evidence requirement. If it's not mapped to a knowledge evidence requirement, then I have to say there's something wrong here, because you're asking questions that are not required as knowledge by the unit of competency. So we need to be confident that there are no knowledge questions that are not mapped to the knowledge evidence items. Then we need to make sure that the knowledge questions actually relate to the knowledge evidence item. And again, we need to read the question, and we may find that the knowledge evidence requirement is one thing, but the question being asked is another thing. And that would again be an issue of invalidity. Then we need to think about all performance requirements are evidenced by more than one observation, or one or more observations. And if we look at the table, we can see that performance criterion 1.1 is observed twice. And I presume that those two observations are different circumstances in some way or another. It would depend on what the performance evidence was asking for. But I will then notice that 1.2 is measured only by a knowledge question. There's a problem. It's not actually observed. And I'll see that PC 1.4 is only observed once. Is that enough? It will depend on whether the unit of competencies performance evidence requirements require more than one observation. So there's a question mark there that would depend on what the performance evidence was saying. Observations are not used to infer knowledge. And so we can see that observation 6, I beg your pardon, from observation 2 is being used to infer knowledge in relation to knowledge evidence 2. Is that appropriate or not? And a person can perform without knowledge, so it's difficult to presume that because they're performing well, that they actually have the knowledge. The only way really to know if a person has knowledge is to ask a question. Performance can happen quite comfortably without knowing how or why that performance is correct. Then we need to make sure that there are no observations that are not mapped to performance requirements. And there we'd need to look at the observation checklist to see whether there were observations that did not relate to the requirements of the unit of competency. And then we need to ask ourselves, do the observation items actually reflect the performance requirement? So we look at the performance criterion, we look at the observation, and we ask the question, do they match? Are we really seeing evidence of this performance criterion? Those issues are validity issues. And the final thing is that we need the foundation skills to be assessed at least once. There's no general requirement that they be assessed twice. Certainly they need to be assessed once. All performance evidence requirements are met. So you'd look at the performance evidence requirements and say, how do I know these performance evidence requirements are being met? And all assessment conditions are met. And we'd need to ask ourselves the question then as to whether or not assessors were appropriately qualified and experienced to conduct those assessments. So just to give you those as a list with which you can work, what you can see here is that item 1 and item 6 contribute to validity. Item 1 and item 2 contribute to fairness. And in terms of the rule of evidence, 1, 3, 4 and 5 relate to validity. That is, if you do those checks, you cover validity. And then if you look at 2 and 6, they cover sufficiency. So you can see that each of these questions is justified in terms of either a principle of assessment or a rule of evidence. If we look at the remaining questions that were asked in those 13 questions, again, the list is here for your use in the future, you can see that what we've done with these questions all related to the rule of evidence of validity. The requirements 10 and 12 relate to sufficiency. So the number and variety of observations meet performance evidence requirements relate to validity and to sufficiency, and all performance evidence requirements are met also relates to sufficiency. And then if you look at questions 8, 11, 12 and 13, they all relate to fairness. So between them, these 13 questions that you'd use when you're mapping and reviewing assessment tools as part of your pre-use validation, all ultimately map to all of the requirements of validity, flexibility, fairness, validity in rule of evidence, and sufficiency in the rule of evidence. They don't tell you about currency, they don't tell you about authenticity, and they don't tell you about reliability. Those are things that we're going to have to look for in different ways. And those are things which are very much related to the process of applying the assessment tools. Many assessors feel the need to add extra questions to the knowledge test or extra observations to the practical activity. And that's because quite often assessors look at the unit of competency and say, this is not enough. There's other stuff that we think should be there. I want to say for a start that that's a dangerous practice to follow, because anything extra you add impacts on fairness, because you are imposing on your students extra requirements that are not being imposed by others. It impacts on validity, because you're changing the tone and nature and coverage of the assessments, and therefore you're altering and not reflecting the requirements of the unit of competency. On the other hand, I understand that this can be an important extra area of interest of a trainer and assessor. And so if you do add extra items to the observation checklist or the knowledge test, you need to make sure of two things. The first is that what you're doing is not changing the difficulty of the task in an observation or the difficulty of the test when it comes to knowledge. In other words, you don't add extra bits to the knowledge test or the observation test that would make it more difficult for a student to demonstrate that they had achieved what the unit required. And secondly, you need to make sure that any answers that they give to those extra bits are not used in making your assessment judgment. Your assessment judgment has to be tied precisely and carefully to the requirements of the unit of competency. You can't introduce extra stuff into your judgment. So those two things need to be considered if you feel the urge to add extra information in. And I might say, by the way, that quite often when one looks at purchase tests, we do often find that there have been extra bits that have slipped in. And what you need to do is, I use the word quarantine. You need to make sure that those extra bits might be useful, but you need to make sure that they don't impact on the student's performance and that they don't impact on your judgment of that student's performance. So let's go back now to the mapping that we had before and see what happens when you apply those 13 tests. And what we discover is, if we look at the validation column, that we can see that performance criterion 1.1 is measured appropriately, so there's a tick. Performance criterion 1.2 is not good, because we're not actually measuring it through observation, we're measuring it through a written or oral question. Which is not telling us that they can perform it. And performance criterion is 1.4 is not acceptable, because normally if a consistency in performance of a unit of competency would need to see it twice. I will need to stress that you need to look at the performance evidence requirements, because quite often the performance evidence requirements will say this needs to be demonstrated at least once. Well, that's pretty obvious that things have to be demonstrated at least once. I would argue, and I have to say that from an auditor perspective, if you do it once, you are compliant, but best practice would be to at least assess twice. Otherwise, you can't get a sense of consistency, nor can you get a sense of transfer across a number of different contexts. So 2 is the best practice, but 1 might be acceptable from a compliance point of view if that's what the unit says. When we come to foundation skills, there's a question mark, because the question is, do we need to see this twice? Technically speaking, no, you don't. It may be, though, that you may want more assurance, in which case you might observe it twice, but generally speaking, once would be enough. When it comes to performance evidence requirements, again, there's a question mark, because do I need to see both these? And it might be that the performance evidence requirement does require both observation 7 and observation 10 to get a different measure of a particular quality. So it's a question mark at this stage. And when we come down to knowledge evidence 1, we can see that, yes, we're asking questions about that. One presumes that the tick also means that the questions asked actually relate to the knowledge evidence requirement. And finally, question knowledge evidence 2 has an observation popped in, and one has to ask what value does that observation contribute? And it's more likely that, in fact, that observation is going to relate to a application of the knowledge rather than the broader base of knowledge that you would hope a person would acquire for transferability in a unit of competency. So it may be that observation 6 is inappropriate and hence the cross in that column. So when we apply those rules, we end up with an adjusted table. And this is where the mapping is useful, because basically what it does is enable you not just to reflect on the qualities of a test, but to improve the test. So now what's happened is that PC 1.1 and 1.2, 1.3 has been put in because it was missing before. One presumes that 1.4 is still there, but we run out of space on this table. And we have observations for each of these. So we can say, well, okay, we are measuring all the performance criteria and we're used by observations. And by checking that the observations relate to the performance criteria, we can put a tick in the validation column. When it comes to foundation skills, we only need 1. So we've reduced the amount of assessment by removing it from observation 2. And that does enable us now to say, well, we are addressing the foundation skills. Performance evidence, maybe we've looked at this and decided that we actually do need to see both observation 7 and observation 10 to get the full picture in relation to performance evidence requirement 1. And we've cleaned up the knowledge test and the knowledge evidence by making sure that we're only using knowledge evidence questions and question 1, 2 and 3 for these 2 items. And in that way, we've made sure that all 13 requirements have been met before we move on. But there's more that we also need to ask, because as I reflected before, the matrix mapping table doesn't deal with everything. And so we do need to make sure that there are, for example, clear instructions for students. And that picks up on fairness. Fairness is a requirement, and that does mean we need clear instructions for students. Fairness is also picked up by the clarity of instructions for evidence gatherers, and that also picks up on the responsiveness to student needs. So, for example, the assessor instructions might talk about how you deal with students who have disabilities, or it might deal with how you might vary the administration of the knowledge test for students who have language or literacy issues. And so the responsiveness of student needs also impacts on fairness. Each of these extra requirements, these 21 requirements, that is the initial 13 plus these extras, all contribute to making sure that everything required by the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence are being met in the design of our assessment tools, or the verification of the quality of purchased assessment tools. So we want to see that there are clear instructions for students. We want to see there are clear instructions for evidence gatherers. We need to see the provision of marking guides, because that contributes significantly to reliability, not just the reliability between assessors, but the reliability of an individual assessor. In other words, yourself, if you're marking answers to knowledge questions, you want to make sure that you are consistent one student to another. There are various problems that can happen, such as where you mark a really good, clear set of answers, and then you mark a set of answers that are not so clear, but could still be accurate, could still be correct, but are not written in such an erudite way. Under those circumstances, it could influence you unless you had a marking guide to make sure that you were being consistent and reliable in your marking. the clarity of instructions for judgment. And I'll come back to this a bit later on. But fundamentally, when you've got the evidence, how do you make a judgment that this person is competent? And so there need to be clear instructions for judgment. The relevance of tasks and knowledge to industry practices. So you need to go back and look at the knowledge questions, and you need to look at the tasks that are being set and say, do these really reflect industry standards? And that has a great deal of importance in terms of validity, because the validity of our assessment processes must reflect competence, and competence is related to workplace practice. So we need to be making sure that they're relevant to industry practices. We need to look at the strength of authentication measures. We're going to look at that a bit later on in our session today, but it really is important that within those instructions to students and instructions to evidence gatherers, there is clear information about authentication. But we'll deal with that again later on. Responsiveness to student needs, again, if a student dealing with students who have particular needs within the framework of validity. In other words, you can't respond in a way which invalidates the unit of competency. So you may have to say to some students, this is not something that is appropriate to you. Hopefully, this will be known before the student even embarks on that particular unit of competency. Because fundamentally you need to make decisions up front about whether or not student needs can be met or whether they can't be. And if they can be met, how can you ensure that you can be responsive to meet those needs within the framework of validity? And again, finally, the credential requirements set for assessors. And you often find that when you look at assessment tools, it will talk about the number of years in particular aspect of the industry that a person needs to have served in order to be acceptable as an assessor. There are, of course, the standard requirements of qualifications that assessors need to have. But as in the past and in the future, the assessors also need to be able to demonstrate not just vocational competence, but industry skills, vet skills and knowledge, and participate in professional development. Those sorts of things may well be specified in the unit of competency as well. And under those circumstances, you need to make sure that that is part of the assessment system. So when you've done that, you've gone through those 21 questions, you will have effectively done your pre-validation. And it does seem like a lot of questions, but you'll discover that it becomes fairly automatic. But it does mean that you need to make sure that before you embark on the use of your assessment tools, all of these 21 criteria have been met. Some are quite sort of small and picky, some are fairly big and broad, but at the end of the day, if you're going to have confidence in the tools you're about to use, you need to have those 21 criteria met. Well, it seems like a lot of work putting the matrix together and going through these 21 criteria. But for the fact that in actual fact, having gone to the trouble of building a mapping, and I do need to stress that this form of mapping is not mandated in the standards. What we're saying is that this is a really good way of doing it. It's a really effective way of doing pre-validation. But we'd also like to say that you can now use the mapping in other ways. And what we're going to say here is if you take the mapping as a document and start using it as a device for recording student performance, then you get extra value from the matrix mapping table. So what we've basically done here, and you'll find one tick, but basically what you see there is we can show that the student has demonstrated in the first test, observation 1, they've demonstrated observation 1, 2 and 3. There should be 3 ticks there. We can see that in that test, observation 3 was demonstrated, but observation 6 was not. And observation 7 was demonstrated. We can see for that student further down that knowledge evidence test that they got all 3 knowledge questions right. We can see that for in observation 2 or test 2, assignment, or task 2, I should say, that they demonstrated observations 1, 2 and 3. And you'll note here that in the record, because they got the foundation skill 1 incorrect, that it's been redone. So that we did the observation 3 and observation 6 again. And what we see from there is that they have demonstrated now subsequently observation 6 and that they are now okay. But observation 10 still they've not demonstrated. So we move from there to this table and we can see that we can make a judgment. And this is really useful because we've got 2 forms of judgment that we can make. First, given that we've seen all of the performance criteria for a particular, all of the performance criteria for a particular element, we can actually tick off the elements. So you'll see up in the top row, element 1 has a tick because all its performance criteria have been seen. We'll see a tick against foundation skill 1 because despite the fact that they initially got number 6 wrong, observation 6 wrong, they've now got observation 6 right, so we can tick that. Performance evidence, we've not seen observation 10, so we would have to say no, they haven't got that performance evidence, met the performance evidence requirement, but we can see that they've demonstrated the knowledge evidence requirements that are shown on this cut down chart. So we can now make the judgments in relation to each particular unit requirement, but we can now look down the right-hand column, the judgment column, and if everything is ticked, then we know that they have demonstrated all the requirements of the unit of competency. Now, why is this valuable? It's valuable in a number of ways, not the least of which is under the compliance requirements, indeed compliance requirement 10C, you need to keep a record of students' assessments for a significant period of time. This record would provide you with a basis for that. And so this could be digital or it could be on paper, whatever strategy you use. But a record of this kind showing what the student demonstrated in relation to each of the components of the knowledge test or tasks or activities, and your judgment would constitute a significant record that would enable you to be able to say, yes, we have used appropriate strategies to assess. We've got evidence of the person's performance, and here's the basis of our judgment in terms of outcome standard, compliance requirement 10C. And I know people are concerned about that, and I think one of the values of this matrix table is that it does that for you. But it also enables you to make other kinds of provide other kinds of information. And so I've described this in a rather crass way as a bonus offer, but there's added value for mapping as well. So, for example, if we added an extra column for learning resources so that we could show where each requirement in the unit of competency was actually delivered as a learning resource, and we can target supplementary learning and assessment. Now, that basically means that where there was a gap, so, for example, in this one, we would see that the student had a problem with observation 10. That relates to performance evidence 1. So we would go back and say, well, okay, we need to do more work on performance evidence 1 and observation 10. So there's supplementary learning, ultimately supplementary assessment, and in that way we meet one of the requirements of outcome 1.1 in terms of providing sufficient time and resources for a student to be able to achieve. We're able to incorporate serendipitous evidence. Serendipitous evidence is where there's evidence that we have outside the formal assessment process. So it might be that when it comes to observation 6, we didn't repeat the test. We may have done a different kind of assessment which enabled us to confirm that the person had achieved that requirement, and therefore we did not need to go back through formal assessment. And that does matter because quite often you have evidence that is real evidence, that is, it meets the principles the rules of evidence of a person's competence, maybe even from a different unit of competency, which means you don't have to repeat the whole assessment. You can actually take that evidence from one place, evidence that was lucky to see, and include it on this table. You'll probably need to put in a note to the effect that that's where the evidence came from. But what you're basically saying is evidence is evidence. It does not need to happen in my formal knowledge test or in my formal written test or in my formal observation of practical activities. If I've seen the evidence somewhere else and I know it meets the rules of evidence, then I can incorporate it into the table. And that's a process that supports fairness and flexibility. We can incorporate evidence gathered through work placements, which again is another aspect of outcome standard 1.1. So there may be actual evidence that we gather not through our formal assessment processes, but through observation of a person in a work placement. Enables us to make a unit-based judgment for each unit assessed in a cluster. And that is important because if we roll the judgment for the two or more units together, we are being invalid, we're being unfair, we're not being reliable, and it has impacts in terms of flexibility. So it's important that going back to a table of this kind, that we are making a judgment that is unit-based, not cluster-based. Then it enables us to meet assessment record requirements, which I refer to in compliance requirement 10. It's actually requirement 10C. It assists with assessment appeals. So here is a basis of evidence. If there's an appeal against a judgment, you have a record here that enables you to process the appeal and manage the outcomes of the appeal. It enables you to map learning resources, which is part of Outcome Standard 1.1. And I might say that is new because in the previous standards, you were not required to demonstrate your learning resources were compliant. It did pop up a bit in 1.3 of the old standards, but it's very specific in Outcome Standard 1.1 that your learning resources meet the requirements of the training product. Mapping evidence you can map evidence required for RPL, and we'll talk about RPL later on, but you'll be able to see here that by using a mapping of this kind with RPL evidence, you are able to show that you are being consistent and reliable and valid in your assessment processes for RPL. So the mapping provides a basis for RPL as well. It means that you can make valid changes for reasonable adjustments, which relates to Outcome Standard 2.4. In other words, if you vary things, since you're working with the same mapping and the same unit requirements, you can show that the reasonable adjustments were indeed reasonable. And finally, you can make sure that this provides evidence of trainer and assessor equivalence. So that, for example, if you are looking at asking the question whether this trainer or assessor is competent to deliver this unit of competency, go back to your assessment mapping tool and use that as a basis for mapping trainer and assessor equivalence. In other words, what you're making sure there is that your trainers and assessors have met equivalence requirements. It won't be assessment requirements so much as equivalence requirements, but the mapping provides a useful framework for that as well. So this page I've noted for myself is off script because basically this is not about validation. It's not about one of the topics of today, but what it's basically saying is that the mapping itself can play an important role in meeting many other outcome standards in the new standards for RTOs. So with that in mind, the mapping suddenly gains value. There's a lot of added value that you can add to mapping through adopting that process. So I urge you to consider it as a way of demonstrating validity and validating your assessments pre-use. It is not mandated that you do it this way, but it's a way that really works. And if we go back to those questions, those 21 questions that you need to ask, incorporating that with a mapping, can be very confident that what you're doing is demonstrating compliance with standard 1.3 and adding an enormous amount of value to the processes and meeting many other standards at the same time as well. One of the standards that we had to meet, though, was authenticity. And so let's have a look now at authenticity. Authenticity is a fundamental question, and that is this the student's own work? And under 1.4, it describes authenticity as the assessors are assured that a vet student's assessment evidence is the original and genuine work of that vet student. And you'll notice that the tiles on the right spell fraud, and that's because, in truth, we really need to talk about the problem of assessment fraud. And there are lots of different kinds of assessment fraud. But I might say that it is fairly a common sort of issue. I'm just holding up a headline here. I don't know if it's readable. No, it isn't really readable. But what it says is a degree of cheating. And it talks about the use of artificial intelligence landing students, WA university students, in hot water. And what we're seeing there is that recent reports have talked about plagiarism and file sharing impacting about 20% of students in universities. And now with artificial intelligence based cheating, there's a rapid rise in those figures. And for universities, this is an existential problem because fundamentally universities are about knowledge, and knowledge is awfully easy to cheat on when it comes to artificial intelligence, plagiarism, collusion, and so on. And indeed, one university lecturer, academic, has commented that this risks devaluing the purpose of a university degree. Now, universities are in particular danger when it comes to this because they're fundamentally knowledge-based. We have an advantage in that in VET we are skills-based as well as knowledge-based, and so we need to see the demonstration of a skill, and when we see a demonstration of a skill, it provides us with an opportunity to explore the knowledge side of things as well through question and answer while they're performing the skill. Nonetheless, even though VET is less vulnerable to fraud, it is possible. And so we need to consider these things. We need to consider plagiarism, where a person claims credit for the work or ideas of someone else. And that could be simply because the student has handed in a piece of work, like some furniture that they made or claimed to have made. It might have been made by someone else. That's plagiarism, strangely, even though it's not about words. But plagiarism is usually about words, where somebody cites someone else without recognition. Collusion, where people are sharing work and claiming that work as their own. Masquerade, where a person participates in an assessment activity on another person's behalf. Surrogacy, where you purchase completed assignments or using artificial intelligence to complete assignments. Fabrication, where you falsify evidence such as surveys or task outcomes. And cheat sheets, where you access resources, answers, digital records and digital resources and so on. I'm using the word cheat sheets, but quite often it's digitally done. And I'd say that in a kind of little tweak, that these are all forms of AI, where I'm really talking about not artificial intelligence, but assisted intelligence. That is, with assistance coming from somebody else or the work of others or machines. All of these things are kinds of fraud that we need to be aware of and need to address. I might also say, although this is not covered in the standards, that you can also have assessor fraud. assessors who fail to follow assessment procedure, who fabricate evidence, who introduce their personal bias, preferences or subjectivity, or even falsify their own credentials. These are kinds of fraud as well, committed by assessors rather than assessees, the students. But these are not authenticity issues in the terms of the standards. But I do want to just mention that we've also got to watch out, not just for students being mischievous, but also assessors on occasion going out off the track. So when we come to asking is this the student's own work, we need to think about what sort of strategies are a risk to authenticity. And they include things like unsupervised assessment tasks. When I was first moved into the vet sector, I was asked to review assessments in apprenticeship areas, and I would see apprentices being assessed on work that had not been observed in terms of its actual construction. So I mentioned before furniture. Your student would proudly stand in front of a whole collection of furniture which they said they made, but could well have been made by somebody else. Because it wasn't observed, it wasn't known if it was the student's own work because the work itself was unsupervised. Things have changed dramatically since then, I might say, but what I'm saying is that it's not just written work that can be unsupervised, it could be practical work that's unsupervised, and under those circumstances, there's a risk of fraud. Online assessment tasks have become really popular, and indeed one of the responses to the universities, indeed, I think it's Edith Cowan University has basically said that they will respond by dropping out the online assessments and going back. They described it as a radical departure, that they were going to actually go back to supervised written assessments as distinct from online assessments. Video and audio observation, and although that can be seen as valid, those can be easily faked. For that matter, online assessment tasks can as well. I remember looking at a particular process where online assessment was being done, and the assessment tool had a process to watch the face of the person using the camera on the computer. It was basically being able to watch what was happening, watch what was happening in the room. Through the microphone on the computer, it was listening for anyone providing information. Through the camera, it was looking to see if the student was focusing on the task or looking at another resource. It was looking at the keystrokes to make sure that the keystrokes were consistent with the individual and so on. And when I finished looking at this fabulous process for managing it, I went to Google search and found very quickly that there was advice on how to beat the system. And one of the things we have is that all of these online assessment monitoring processes have flaws, have loopholes, have ways of bypassing them. Group activities can be a problem because it may be very difficult to discern through a group activity whether the work is that of an individual student. Shared answers, where students have an opportunity to share answers as kind of group activity. Purchase assignments is a problem. And I remember running a session for a regional RTO, and on my way up to the RTO, I searched online for assignment, and I found that someone was offering written answers for sale for that assignment. Access to artificial intelligence can introduce a problem, and weirdly, open book assessments. And I do want to stress here that open book assessments may be valid if indeed that is what industry expects. In other words, if a person undertaking a task in the workplace has access to manuals and guides and digital information, then open book assessment's fine. But if the individual working in the workplace does not have access to those resources, then an open book assessment creates a kind of fraud, because what an open book assessment says is this person has this knowledge when they don't necessarily have that knowledge. They know where to find the knowledge, but they may not have the knowledge. So when it comes to open book assessments, you need to ask yourself the question, what is the practice in industry? Do my assessment processes reflect what is required in industry? There are a number of strategies that various organisations use to detect fraud, and these are all a little bit, they provide clues, but they don't provide certainty. So, for example, if you notice inconsistency of performance on similar units, that might suggest that there's a bit of fraud going on. But it may not. It may be that they are performing quite differently on these units quite legitimately. You might pick up a difference in writing style or voice. You might say, well, this is not how they speak. But I've noticed that quite often, particularly with international students, that they might be able to write really well, but not speak really well in terms of English expression. And under those circumstances, you might think there's fraud, but it might be, in fact, not the case. There could be variability of performance within a unit over time. You know, they suddenly get better or they suddenly get worse. It could be a clue. There could be a discrepancy between what they know and what they can do, and that could be a clue. There could be a discrepancy between what you see on campus and what you see in the workplace. That could be a clue. And digital detection systems can be used, but as I've indicated before, those digital detection systems can be cheated. So, for example, there are systems to look for plagiarism. There are systems to look for artificial intelligence use, and each of these can work, but they can also give you false positives. By that I mean false indication of fraud. And students can actually play the game. So I've seen, for example, students who will apply the detection system to their assignment and then adjust the assignment until the detection system shows that fraud is unlikely. So all of these give you a clue, but they don't really confirm or establish that there is fraud. So we need to look at preventative measures. Let's look at those. So common strategies include supervised assessment tasks with an identity check. And I have to say that that's the only way you really can know with absolute certainty that the person doing the task is doing the task. And this often happens within the context where there is a licensed requirement, particularly if a licensing requirement that relates to police or other critical services. Observed assessment tasks without the identity check, but nonetheless, it does enable you to know that this particular person is doing this particular job. Warnings and penalties for assessment fraud, it's helpful so long as they are significant warnings and very visible warnings and significant penalties. Digital detection systems, I've mentioned before, can be easily bypassed and actually manipulated to make things look less like fraud or, faking or artificial intelligence. Warnings against assessment fraud is awfully soft. And a student signed declaration gives you no protection at all. And I mentioned before, Edith Cowan University is talking about introducing innovative approaches to assessment, such as removing unsupervised online tests. Fundamentally, what they've decided, ECU has decided to deal with fraud, is to basically say, go to the top of this list and say, we will supervise everything. Well, that could be a big job, but nonetheless, it's the only way really to establish authenticity. But I'm suggesting to you two strategies here. One is to control the assessment environment and observe every assessment task. That basically means that all observations required by the unit of competency are directly observed by either an assessor or a trusted person whose job is to establish authenticity. They may not necessarily be judging performance, but they can be confirming that the performance evidence gathered is that of that person. So a controlled assessment environment and observation of assessment tasks is the sort of a pinnacle way of knowing things are authentic. All the other measures are manipulable. But if that's too much, then there's another way, and that is to have some of the assessment done in a way that is unobserved, but then authenticated by reassessing a sample of either assessment tasks, such as practical tasks, or knowledge tests in a controlled assessment environment. And what you're basically doing there is saying, well, we will make sure that you know that we will be assessing and observing and authenticating. So you need to make sure that at the very start you let students know that you are going to be observing and authenticating their work. And you need to let them know that the consequences of fraudulent activity are significant, and that they need to know up front that if they are found to have committed assessment fraud, there will be consequences that will impact on their training and on their futures. So there's the warning initially, and then there's a process, either one where all assessments are observed, or where you have an authentication process that establishes that the evidence you're getting is in fact authentic evidence. I need to stress, by the way, that where you are reassessing for authentication processes, you don't need to meet the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment, because what you're establishing is not their competency. What you're establishing is the authenticity of the evidence they've already given you. So the purpose of the reassessment is authentication, not a judgment of competency. When you've authenticated the evidence, then you can make a judgment of competency on the basis of the evidence that they've provided you. So we need to think of the authentication process as a softer process, as a less formal process. It might indeed be done by someone who isn't necessarily a qualified assessor, because what you're trying to establish here is authenticity rather than competency. And once you've established authenticity, you can then accept the evidence as credible, and then you make a competency judgment of competent or not yet competent on the basis of that evidence. So authenticity is a challenge. I'm afraid to say that we don't have any magic formula other than seeing is believing. And when you see a person perform, you know then that they are the evidence is authentic. Now we need to move to assessment validation. This is the penultimate topic. We've got assessment validation and RPL to deal with. And this relates to clause 1.5 or standard 1.5 in the new standards. And it basically states that the assessment system is quality assured by appropriately skilled and credentialed persons through a regular process of validating assessment practices and judgments. Now, this is now quite specifically the assessment system. And so when we start thinking about the assessment system, we are now taking into consideration a whole bunch of additional things. So we still involves a repeat of the 21 questions we mentioned earlier, because we still need to know that the resources we're using continue to be valid, reliable, sufficient, and the processes we use are authentic and current and so on. So we need to know all of those things still apply. But now we're adding policies and procedures, so we need to validate the policies and procedures. If we find there are problems because our policies and procedures are lacking in some way, lacking in specificity, or misdirect the process, or not up to date in relation to current processes in vet assessment, we need to look at the design and selection of assessment tools, which takes us to those 21 questions earlier on. But now we need to add to it the application of the assessment tools. Were proper procedures adhered to by the assessors and others involved in the assessment process? We need to ask ourselves, is the management of the assessment evidence appropriate? And that's where mapping might play a role, because as you could see from the discussion earlier, that mapping provides a way of managing assessment evidence. And we need to know that that evidence is managed in a way that both preserves the evidence and its integrity and also enables us to make a meaningful judgment. We need to make sure that our validation takes into consideration how we select and monitor assessors. And it's really important to see here that unlike pre-validation, we are now validating the work of the assessors as well, which is one of the reasons why assessors can't be make a judgment about validation as the sole involvement. There needs to be other people involved. And at this point, we also look out for assessor fraud. By that, I mean we're asking the question, are they complying with the requirements? Are they allowing their personal prejudices and preferences to impact on their judgment? Which takes us to making judgments. And we basically want to see again, maybe through the process, that there's a judgment process that enables you to go from the evidence to a judgment in a way which is consistent and reliable and valid. And then finally, weirdly in a way, the whole of the breast of this snake needs to be validated. That is are our validation processes good? And I might say that one of the problems that I've seen as an auditor from time to time is that people that judge their processes to be, their assessment tools to be valid, using an invalid validation process. Usually not so much invalid as incomplete. And that's where I think the 21 questions earlier on is important, because those 21 questions plus the questions you'll need to ask about application and the like, all contribute to making sure your validation process itself is valid. So we go back to the earlier questions that we asked right back at the beginning, and that is the 7 criteria of consistency with the training product, principles of assessment and rules of evidence, which are picked up in the 21 questions, sufficient resources and time, relevance to industry, responsive to individual needs, and credentialed assessors. And each of these has implications to various requirements. For example, sufficient resources and time is actually a requirement under Outcome Standard 1.8. Relevance to industry is a requirement under Outcome Standard 1.2. Responsiveness to individual needs picks up on fairness and flexibility. It picks up on RPL. It picks up on access to assessors. It picks up on reasonable adjustment, and it picks up on appeals. And credentialed assessors all relate to the requirements and the credential requirements that are part of the standards for RTOs 2025. So we have these broad questions, these 7 questions, plus the 21 specific questions that relate to the specific assessment tools to consider when we come to validation. It's not a small task, and as I said before, one of the problems we often see is that people use maybe just the pre-validation instruments to validate post-assessment use, and they need to. Their problem there is that it doesn't go far enough to consider how the assessment tools are actually used. And so when we start looking at sufficient resources and times, we start looking at responsive to individual needs and consistency with the requirements, we can see straight away that we go beyond just a paper analysis of the assessment tools to how they actually function. And that all happens within a protocol. And so first we have to consider the criteria for validation, which we've discussed already. Then we need to select the training products to be validated, and the standards talk about risk, but fundamentally all training products need to be validated, and so that fundamentally it relates to every qualification needs to be validated, every skill set needs to be validated, every standalone unit needs to be validated, every accredited short course or module needs to be validated. But when it comes to a qualification, you don't validate every unit of competency. You would select units of competency to validate, and on the basis of that validation, if you found that there are issues, you would then extend the sample to cover more and more units to make sure that the issue identified in the sample of units also informed us in terms of what happens across the board. And that could be across that individual industry area, or it could be across the whole RTO. Fundamentally, when you get outcomes from your validation process, it can have implications for policies, for procedures, organisational ethos, for the way you manage trainers and assessors in particular, of course. So you can see that you may start off with a focused validation on a small aspect of a training product, and that can then blow out to be a bigger inquiry if you find there are problems. Frequency of validation needs to be done for every training product every 5 years, but there may be reasons why you need to do it more often. For example, there could be an intrinsic risk in relation to the product. So it might be something that is intrinsically dangerous, in which case you would want to make sure that your assessment processes were good early in the process rather than wait 5 years to do it. And of course, it may well be that the product is difficult to assess, in which case you may want to say, well, I better look at the assessment processes to make sure that I've not taken risks in terms of how I'm assessing this difficult thing. And it's partly a problem that if something is easy to assess, you're not likely to have a problem. But if something is difficult to assess, you need to be more consistent in your monitoring of that quality. There's the assessment mode, and so it may be that accessibility is a problem or authenticity is a risk, in which case you may want to conduct more validations to make sure that quality of evidence is good. And then you may have feedback from students or from trainers or assessors or from industry or from audits that there are problems and to undertake more frequent validation exercises. So take into consideration the product itself, the mode of assessment, and any feedback in terms of determining whether you wait 5 years or you conduct earlier validations to make sure that you don't have cohorts of students going through with an invalid assessment process and strategy. Personnel to be involved in validation, of course, is defined, and unlike previous standards, there is an expectation and an acceptance of the person involved in conducting the assessments being involved in the validation, but they can't have sole responsibility for the outcome of the validation, and that's because they are themselves being validated. And then outcomes and action basically saying, well, as I said before, it could be that you only need to fix that particular problem in that particular assessment process and strategy, or it may be that you need to go beyond that and look at the other units of competency within that qualification or other qualifications in that industry area, or it might be an issue across the board for the RTO. Okay, we move to our last topic, which is recognition of prior learning. And recognition of prior learning is really an important issue because it's one of the qualities of a competency-based system where the competencies come from workplaces, and it's not uncommon to find that people who come from those workplaces already have the competencies. They do the training, but they have the competency by virtue of the fact that they have experience and have worked within that industry. So it wasn't possible to talk really meaningfully about RPL prior to the development of competency-based approaches. But if we're going to certificate a person as competent, then there needs to be an assessment process. In other words, it's clear that the standards require that you can't certificate a person unless they have, in fact, got the evidence of their competency. So recognition of prior learning means an assessment process to determine the extent to which the individual meets the requirements specified in the training product. Usually that means, of course, a unit of competency, but it could mean a module. Outcome 1.6 explains that the RTO must be able to demonstrate decisions relating to recognition of prior learning that they are based on evidence of prior skills, learning and experience and are undertaken in accordance with the organisation's assessment system and are documented and decided in a way which is fair, transparent, consistent amongst vet students and maintains the integrity of the training product. So that basically means that RPL must meet the standards of other assessments. And that's another reason why using the mapping as a tool could be useful, because the mapping covers any kind of judgment that you might be making in relation to a training product. RPL, it also goes on to say under 1.3, RPL assessment processes, well, it doesn't say this, but given that it must be consistent with your RTO standards for assessment, then we can infer from that RPL assessment processes must be fit for purpose and consistent with training products and are reviewed prior to use. So that basically, 1.3 is basically saying not just for classroom-based or formal assessment processes, the formal assessment process of RPL must also meet the standards of 1.3. The standards of 1.4 must also be met by RPL. RPL assessment processes must be conducted in a way which is fair and appropriate and enables accurate assessment judgment of vet student competency, including the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. So RPL is not in some way or other exempt from those requirements. And then under 1.5, it reminds us that RPL assessment processes must be quality assured through a regular process of validating RPL assessment practices judgments. In other words, standard 1.5 applies to RPL as well. So when we look at RPL, we recognise that we have some particular issues. And that's because the evidence we're using is from the past. So we have to ask these questions of the evidence that we're gathering and the judgments we make. First of all, how do we know that this evidence from the past is actually evidence that is irrefutably that of the student? In other words, how do we know that the evidence they're presenting wasn't done by somebody else? Secondly, we need to know, can they still do it? It might be evidence of the past, but they still have that quality. The validity of evidence, the evidence relate to the unit requirement, or is it possible that what we're seeing is something that's different? Sufficiency, is there enough credible evidence that can be used to make an informed judgment? Reliability, can we make consistent judgments based on this evidence? And the validity of the judgment, can we actually make a valid judgment? And our final slide in terms of information that we're sharing with you today is to look at the process of RPL in a way which enables us to achieve some economies, but not lose quality. So what we're suggesting is you start off by pre-assessing the past evidence. Is it worth going on? You look at the past evidence and basically say, do I have prima facie grounds for thinking this person probably is competent? Now, that is not a formal assessment process. That is a soft process where we're just asking the question, is it worth continuing? If it is worth continuing, if it's not worth continuing, they go and do the training. If it is worth continuing, then conduct the knowledge assessment because it's quick and cheap. And if they can't get the knowledge, demonstrate the knowledge, then there's no point in going on to the more expensive part of the process, which is a skills assessment. So if they can't demonstrate the knowledge, go to do the training. Then you go to, if they have demonstrated the knowledge, then go to a skills assessment. You don't need to do all of the skills assessments. You need to cover all of the skills requirements, but you only would need to do the skills assessment once because that would establish that they had the competency, but it wouldn't establish that they had transferability and consistency. But at least when you've done the assessment, skills assessment at 3, you know they have the knowledge and skills, which now enables you to go back to the past evidence and say, well, this is now not being used to establish they have the knowledge and skills. I know that. It's now being used to establish that they have consistency and transferability and retention. And so what you can see is that we can then use the evidence from the past, if you like, as the second evidence of competency. And in that way, you've saved a good deal of time and a good deal of effort, but have not in any way compromised on standards. So there we need to stop because literally time has run out on the dot. I just need to draw your attention to references and resources, the registration standards for 2025, and the online guidance hub, which provides really valuable information. Mel mentioned earlier on that there will be fact sheets that will be coming out in the future to provide you with additional assistance. But what we need now to do is to look at questions.
So here's our first question.
Yes, you can, and indeed, you can through an observation. You can ask questions, and indeed, it's quite often valuable. So that you might be watching a person using a lathe with a particular material, and you might well say, "Well, how would things be different if you were using a different material, or different tools, or a different brand of lathe?" So yes, you can elaborate by asking knowledge questions as part of an observation assessment. But what you're not doing there is you're not using the observation as an indication of evidence. You're using the questions that you asked as part of the knowledge questioning. So it's basically saying you can ask knowledge questions during an observation. Yep. Assessment includes practical application components that enable the vet student to demonstrate relevant skills and knowledge in a practical setting. So that's a very good question. It's very much, it goes back to that very first question that was asked, and basically it says, yes, you can ask questions during practical performance. At this stage, we're basically saying you can ask knowledge questions through knowledge questions, but the important thing is that the knowledge questions relate both in terms of industry practice and in terms of what is required in the performance criteria. There needs to be a relationship between them. In other words, the knowledge questions that you ask need to be both at the level of the performance required and consistent with the knowledge required. I don't think we want to create too much of a silo thing here where there's knowledge in one part of the process and practical skills on the other. So asking knowledge questions during practical performance is a good practice. I don't think that it is right. Validity. Assessment evidence is adequate such that the essay can be reasonably assured that the vet student possesses. How do we find reasonably assured? It's a very good question there. That's one of the problems we have with standards in any walk of life, is that there are words like reasonably assured that pop in. I think that we need to be stronger than reasonably assured. I think we need to be certain. And that's why I went back to that notion of multiple assessments in order to be sure. The definition of competency talks about consistency and transfer. So I would argue that reasonably assured means that even though it says at least once that 2 really is the best practice, but in some circumstances, many more than 2 are needed to be reasonably assured the person possesses the skills and knowledge. And strangely enough, in lots of ways, that's going to be looked at in terms of validation in the future. So that if you find, for example, that your graduates are not performing well, you might want to go back and say, did I skimp on assessment? Was my reasonable assurance not adequate? But I would argue that 2 is the minimum. It is not the minimum in terms of the standards. If the unit says at least 1, that means that 1 is the minimum if it's what the unit says. So it's you've asked a very good question and a very difficult question to answer, because we don't actually have a formal answer to that. But we do have an answer in terms of logic and best practice, and that would say 2 is a minimum. Otherwise, you can't judge consistency and transfer. So we look at the next one. No, I understand what you're saying, but it does say at least once, and so at least once does give you permission to go twice. But what you are doing now there is basically making it clear. See, think about the student too. If the student thinks they only have to demonstrate it once, then they won't necessarily learn the skill in a way which will make it transferable. So by assessing something twice, where you change the conditions and the circumstances or the resources or even the equipment, means that the student understands that they've got to utilise this competency in more than one setting. And as soon as that happens, then the way they think moves from rote learning to meaningful learning. So you are making it more difficult and more demanding, but not being unfair. I think it really is important that you, in your teaching and when you demonstrate a competency, that you demonstrate the competency in a number of different ways, so that they can see that the competency is not the right performance of that competency, but a performance of a skill and knowledge that can be transferred and used consistently over a number of different contexts. So it's very important, I think, that we don't want students who think that a competency is one thing, rather they need to be able to see its transferable quality that they can apply in a number of different circumstances. So in that sense, you're being fair, even though you're being a bit more demanding. Serendipitous evidence can prerequisites with common requirements be used rather than repeating a task. Yes. Look, I mean, evidence is evidence so long as it meets the rules of evidence. So fundamentally, you have to be confident that that evidence that you saw in prerequisites with common requirements are in fact the same quality. So that does mean that you don't have to do it multiple times. But do watch out. Because sometimes you'll find performance criteria, particularly in the MEM training package, and in other training packages too. The performance criteria for one unit can be the same as the performance criteria for another unit, but contextually they're different. So, for example, startup procedures for a mobile crane, the performance criteria for the startup procedures will be the same as the performance criteria for the startup procedures of, say, a forklift, but the context is different. So although the wording is the same, the context is different, and you can't infer that because they follow one set of startup procedures, they automatically know what the startup procedures are for the other. So always make sure that if you're finding evidence in prerequisites or in other units, that they are actually really the same and not just appear to be the same. Yep. Next question. You don't have to. Keep in mind the mapping document is not mandated, but it's a really nice idea. And I'm not saying you're doing this for the auditor, but I have to say that it does make our auditing much easier, but it must also make it easier for you. And I have seen examples where when a mapping has been done of the training resources, it's discovered that there are gaps in the training resources, and the gaps that would have been unnoticed without the mapping. So the mapping of the training resources is really good, but it also does help you demonstrate compliance with standard 1.1. So it's not the only way you can do it, but it's a really good way of doing it. Next question. Look, it doesn't. You need to know that it doesn't say pre-validation in the standards. It talks about review pre-use. I think the actual terminology. I'll just flick through my notes here and see what the actual terminology. It talks about pre-use, but it does not talk about pre-validation. Pre-validation is certainly acceptable in your policies and processes because that's what you're doing. So you could either call it pre-validation, pre-use validation, or review pre-use. Validation is a good word to use because validation as a process is well defined. So it's certainly acceptable, and I would probably recommend it, even though it's a bit of a variation from the wording in the standards. Well, I would argue no and yes. The no is if you're doing pre-validations correctly in the 2015 standards, you don't need to change. But as I said in my comments earlier, I've often seen people using pre-validation processes that are a little bit skimpy. But no, I would argue that in relation to pre-validation, there isn't any significant change. No. Yes, but I wouldn't call that an open book assessment. Fundamentally, if the chart or specification or standards, etc., are things that they would normally access as a resource, then what you're doing is they're interpreting. The answer to the question is not found in the text of the book. It's found in their interpretation of the chart or the specifications of the standards. So it's basically a question is that if you're so often with open book assessments, they're really measuring comprehension. Do you understand what you're reading rather than knowledge? Do you know what's in the book? So if they're looking at a chart or specifications or standards, they're doing what they would normally do, I presume, in the workplace. That is, they're going to a standard. For my part, as an auditor, I refer to the standards. So me looking at the standards is not inappropriate because that's the nature of the work. But if I went to AI for an interpretation of the standards, that would be inappropriate because I have to be able to interpret those standards myself. It shouldn't be something that I go to someone else to answer. So the answer is going to be no, that's not a problem because what you're looking for is the interpretation of the chart, specifications and standards rather than just repeating the chart, specifications or standards. But if they need to know the specifications and standards off by heart, then indeed you would need to be closed book. So this one, would an assessor written feedback to the student about their assessment also need to be seen to support the ticks and crosses they put in the mapping matrix example shown today? I would say only if no, that's really the written feedback to a student about their assessments, particularly if there are issues and ceases to be an assessment issue, becomes a learning issue. And so it's not something that would need to be seen to support the ticks and crosses. However, if you were doing something out of the ordinary, in other words, if you were using serendipitous information, if you were carrying a supplementary assessment of some sort, then I think you would need to include notes. So in my model of, which I didn't really show you in full on the chart, would include a comments column where there would be an opportunity to put in comments where things were out of the ordinary. So I would turn the validation column into a comments column, and write in notes in relation to the student's performance where things were done in a way that was different to the original plan. But if things are done according to the original plan, the tick enables you to go back to the question on the written test, or the tick enables you to go back to the observation, see what the observation was. So strangely enough, from the ticks and crosses, you can reconstruct the student's performance. If there's a cross, then you may want to put in why, make a note as to why it was a cross, so that provided you with remediation advice. Yes, basically they do. I mean, fundamentally, it would all RPLs require a knowledge assessment for lots of reasons. One, of course, is the knowledge base may have changed since they acquired the competency. But the knowledge base is also critical to the definition of the unit of competency. So you need to know not only do they have the knowledge, but that it's up-to-date knowledge. So knowledge assessment really is important, but it also tells you whether it's worth going ahead. If fundamentally they can't demonstrate the knowledge, then there's no point in going on with the skills assessment. You're just going to be wasting your time and theirs. What you do is go say to them, you need to do the training. However, I will add a little codicil to that. A student who embarks on RPL has not had the benefit of being embraced by you as an RTO. They've not had the chance to be nurtured and supported by you in the training. So why not make the student who's undergoing RPL, why not give that student access to the learning materials? And basically say to them, I'm setting a knowledge test on these learning materials. So, come back and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. And let's do the knowledge test then. So they are working off the same base as your other students. That way, if they've got knowledge that's out of date, it will be updated by your learning materials, and it'll also remind them as to what is required. They can find that out, of course, from the looking at the unit of competency, but it's not until they would actually see your learning resources. So it's no cost to you really to basically give them access to the knowledge, the learning resources ahead of the knowledge test, and then put them through the face-to-face knowledge test that you've already mentioned in your question. Okay, no, I wouldn't say there was a difference because, in fairness, the benchmarks for students should be the same benchmarks used by assessors. But what we really want to stress here, what I would like to stress here, and maybe I'm missing the question again, is that the unit of competencies performance criteria provide benchmarks. But those are not benchmarks that are task-related or workplace-related in the sense that they tell you what to look for. So you take the performance criteria, you convert it into a task or into a workplace and say, well, I would see this particular quality by looking for this particular activity or this particular product or this particular outcome. And that becomes then an observation checklist. And that observation checklist should be the same for the students as it is for the assessors. And so that they are making this, so the students, in fairness, are working to demonstrate the same qualities as the assessors are looking for. So I wouldn't see that there were differences between the benchmarks for students in an observation checklist and benchmarks for assessors. I would expect them to be the same.
Awesome.
Yep.
And here is our very last question.
Look, I don't have a problem with that, but and indeed the mapping is useful there too, because you can you can record observations through that you're seeing. But it is important that that we don't get confused here between formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment is basically evidence we're gathering in the process of learning. That guides our learning, in other words. So keeping in mind that two things here, that we don't want to break the assessment process down so that it becomes kind of incremental. At the end of the day, when a person performs a task, they generally have to perform the whole task from one end to the other in a coherent and way that is relevant to the workplace. So if you teach a bit and assess and teach a bit and assess and teach it a bit and assess, you may get a false impression that they're competent, because by the time you get to the end of that process, they may well have forgotten the first part. So I would argue that it's not improper, but it may not be helpful. You may get a false impression of their competence. Okay, I think we're done.
Yes.
Thank you for those who have persisted for an extra half an hour. You're brilliant. And I see quite a lot of people brilliant who have stayed with us. But thank you very much for being with us this morning.